All right, what is up, guys? Let's dive into our task for today. So, to recap the last class on rival states, we had Cuba and its issues with its communism and proximity to the United States, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it still has a hold on Florida voters, which keeps it super relevant in US politics today. Related to that, not only in proximity, language, and its effect on Florida voters is Venezuela, socialism and oil. Then we have North Korea, isolation and nukes, and also containment of Chinese influence. The other big rival states are China, manufacturing independence. China needs us, we need China, but there's this competition to be the new global leader. We have Russia, constant invasions and more invasions, and oh, look, even more invasions. And then Iran, so lack of cooperation with the rest of the Middle East, and in their death to America, death to Israel chants. Today we were supposed to go over bureaucracy, but we didn't get enough time to do the spheres of influence. And I feel like we've done bureaucracy, at least for now, to death. We've even started talking court politics. So instead, I want to finish off current policy issues with different states, or different regions at least. So today we're doing Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. And then Thursday we'll be doing Asia, the Middle East, Antarctica, and space. So to kick off, we'll start with Africa. In the continent Africa, we're going to be talking about different countries, and it's generally best to avoid referring to all of Africa like it's one giant country. So this is a 300 level class, and I'm sure most of you going to UT grew up in the South, so you can probably tell that the United States relationship with pre-colonial Africa, or we'll call it colonial Africa at this point, was through triangle trade, or the importation of slaves mainly from West Africa. But for a quick refresher on triangle trade, it would be manufactured goods sold to Africa in exchange for slaves, slaves sold to North America and South America, and then in exchange for raw materials from the Americas taken to Europe. This was immensely profitable at the time. Of course, this involved some of the most completely inexcusable, fucked up practices in human history. The thing about slavery is that every time you think you've reached the bottom, to find out how horrifically these people were abused, you think you've hit bedrock, and then you find out that it just keeps going, and the details get worse and worse and worse the more you study it. If you're interested in more, I would recommend talking to someone who's a bit more qualified than me. But we do need to take a second and acknowledge that part of almost our defining relationship with the continent of Africa started with these horrible abuses. Like I said, every time you think you've learned something about slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, it just gets worse. One that we do need to go over, however, is the selling of African slaves by Africans. Now, the manufactured goods that were coming into Africa at the time, especially West Africa, were guns. And the thing is that the different ethnic groups and tribes within Africa were already frequently at odds against each other. And so whoever gets the guns is going to have an upper hand in any conflict. So they're almost forced by these market dynamics. If I don't get the guns, my enemies are going to get the guns, so I'm being forced to either lose a war or participate in slavery. And that kind of sets up a lot of the whole world's relationship with Africa is importing weapons to extract resources. It's gotten better. Um, Per capita, less slaves are coming out of Africa. Um, that being said, there's more slaves alive now than there ever were, if you count human trafficking. My point being to all this, though, is that from a very early time, Africans were being pitted against each other by Europeans and Americans, of course. Now, for continents, Africa has the most states in it for any continent. So we're not going to have enough time to go over all of them. But starting with the first one being most prescient in US history is probably Liberia. Think about the root word for Liberia, liber, free. And that was actually started by American abolitionists or people who wanted to abolish slavery. And the idea was that black people would be safer in Africa than in the United States. So there's this big effort to repatriate what was formerly African Americans back to Africa. And the capital of Liberia today is even called Monrovia after President Monroe, who I think this is the last we talk about him. Now, with Liberia, there's this big effort to set up an American-style democracy there, especially with former slaves who had been, were from the United States, if not had been born there. Didn't work out. It didn't have the support to sustain itself. As time goes on, one recurring theme that we'll find is that democracies need a certain level of wealth to be stable. But wouldn't you believe we actually tried it again with Eritrea? Now, we weren't exporting slaves to Eritrea, mainly because this program was in the 1990s. But there were efforts to send Harvard and Ivy League academics to Eritrea to help run the government, make it into a democracy. That didn't work either. On the left, we have a Libyan rebel, and on the right, we have Eritrean soldiers. Just to be indicative of how these states continue to not really be able to take off like we want them to. And part of that is because just the lack of development. And then when war breaks out, the entire area is just sort of only built for war, so it gets caught in this war trap. An interesting comparison would be post-World War II Japan. It was already developed to a degree, but still nothing like the United States. But during the Allied occupation of Japan, they weren't importing guns. They weren't extracting resources. It was just a big investment in Japan to try to make it more self-sustaining. And of course, we'll get to this later, but Japan's never going to be fully self-sustaining because it's not allowed to have a military. But to say that Africa can't be developed if done right, I think is completely not true. And then the other major development success for the United States is the entire continent of Europe, which we'll get to in a second. But the Marshall Plan after World War II, sure, there was already democratic and physical infrastructure, but Europe would not be the same without the Marshall Plan. And that didn't involve sending guns to Europe, it involved investing in Europe. Another big case is Sudan and South Sudan, and even saying those sort of make it sound like you're choosing a side on that debate, whether or not South Sudan has a right to exist. Mainly two ethnic groups lumped in together want to split up but don't know how to in a fair way where all the different ethnic groups within the country are able to be satisfied. because of that and oil wealth and a weak central government or unstable government, it's basically constantly a civil war. Another state that's come up recently has been Somalia. While we're in East Africa with Eritrea, we'll talk about that real quickly. So, early 1990s, there's a big famine in Somalia. And this guy on the left, a warlord named Mohammed Farah Aidid, used the UN supply of food brought in to give famine relief to gain more power for himself. He would intercept the UN food shipments, and if you didn't listen to what he would say, you wouldn't get fed. So this became a major human rights issue where the UN was essentially enabling a dictator, or at least a warlord. So the warlord stealing all this food led the U.S. Special Forces to be deployed into Somalia to try to arrest different warlords and keep the food flowing. This famously resulted in the Black Hawk Down incident. The U.S. military has a leave no man behind policy. Black Hawk helicopter was shot over Mogadishu, the main city in Somalia, and soldiers had to be deployed throughout the streets to try to rescue them. And it ended up being a very, very famous book at the time. So this is early 90s, I believe 92 or 93 when this occurred. The book was made into a movie in 2001. It came out, I think, summer 2001. But it was a really big first look as to like, oh, this is what warfare is now, which is the title says, A Story of Modern War. And I'm actually going to recommend the movie. If you look at war movies in American history, it starts with like very pro-war stuff. Literally, John Wayne goes to anti-war with the 70s and Vietnam, back to pro-war, Cold War, roided out Europeans killing Soviets. But then there's this weird gap in the 90s and early 2000s that Black Hawk Down is in, because after 9/11, there's this sort of species of movie or flavor of movie where everything has really deep political messaging, kind of like before Black Hawk Down too. But this movie is actually just pretty objective, I guess I would say. And then, of course, during the post 9/11 war movies, you also have Kung Fury, which is an absolute masterpiece if y'all haven't seen it. He gets to go back in time and gets a dinosaur and then kills Hitler. Badass. Now, a lot of Somalia is just completely anarchic, or at least the federal government's not strong, and it's more run by localized warlords, leading to more and more poverty because of the war trap we talked about. If the environment and infrastructure is really only built for war, then it's really all they're going to do without external development. Most of the time, the external resources being sent to Somalia are legal, but sometimes they're taken illegally by, and this became a big issue in 2010, 2011, pirates. Somali pirates became a big thing. There was this famous hostage incident called Captain Phillips when the Maersk Alabama was taken by them. It's where the whole I am the captain now thing came. Good movie, by the way. Tom Hanks. Barkhad Abdi is the name of the pirate who dropped that epic line and then just sort of haven't seen him in anything since, which is a big disappointment. People often forget that Catherine Keener is in that movie too. As a fellow Keener, I have to say I'm a huge fan of hers. But why Somali pirates? Well, if you check out this Suez Canal and Bab el Mandeb, and just all the shipping routes and stuff sent through there, you can see it's prime real estate for piracy. So the global response led by the United States was Operation Ocean Shield. which didn't need to stay in that operation to be that effective. And then, of course, there have since the Captain Phillips incident, there's been increased security on ships going through that area. But yeah, Operation Ocean Shield was, for obvious reasons, very one-sided. And around that time, there was a big push to have more Somali refugees and migrants brought into the United States. And as a more recent group of immigrants, they've had a very interesting time. Very recently, I believe it was during Christmas, there was the scandal with the Somali daycare that brought down Governor Tim Walz, who, if you'll remember, was a candidate for vice president not that long ago. And we see Somali immigrants getting into politics. Very divisive figure, Ilhan Omar. Whether or not you love her or hate her is pretty indicative of how you feel about both of the parties. Um, they've mainly settled in Minnesota, which in fact changed its flag to reflect the Somali community more, which is very cool. All right. To the south of Somalia, we have Rwanda. So Rwanda was was a European colony for a while, and there are two main ethnic groups there. Um, on the left, you can see a member of the Tutsi group, and on the right, you can see Juvenal Habyarimana. I've butchered that, I apologize. The guy on the left is Paul Kagame, but there are two main leaders within their communities. So left is Tutsi, right is Hutu. Um, in like ethnic groups, they tend to look a lot like people within their own ethnic group, and the Tutsis were seen as more than, or seen as an upper class to the Hutus, mainly because their skin isn't as dark. And that's as cartoonishly racist as colonialism was, by the way. European powers leave, and there's been decades, if not centuries, of resentment between these two groups. So, without the protection of the Europeans, the Hutus take a bunch of machetes and initiate what's called the Rwanda genocide. Um, estimated deaths are around 500,000. And this all occurred over about 100 days, and also in the early 90s, 1994. So why this was so controversial, especially for the United States, aside from it being a fucking genocide, was the fact that there was a UN peacekeeping presence there that didn't really do much. A big sort of thing people were saying after the Holocaust in Nazi Germany was never again. And so, of course, people were like, well, is it never again? Or as this article asks, what's the point of peacekeepers if they don't keep peace? We'll quit talking about movies soon, but if you want to better look at what that was like, there's a movie called Hotel Rwanda that covers the story of Paul Rusesabagina, a hotel manager who shielded hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Tutsis and protected them from the genocide. In the hotel, and they drank from the pool and lived in the rooms, and he did everything he could as a Hutu, so a member of the ethnic group that was murdering people, to protect others. And yeah, 2004, I believe it was made into this movie. The movie makes him a household name. I remember seeing it when I came out, and I was like, holy shit, I am way too young for this, because it's a very, very brutal movie. But when the movie came out, people were like, well, where's Paul Rusesabagina today? And believe it or not, he was a taxi driver. But the movie launched him back into the public eye. He's recognized as the legitimate fucking hero he is. And then, yeah, he was sent to prison for terrorism, and then they found out the charges were trumped up. But yeah, overall, very interesting story. But that's what kicks off, and if you've been in my RR class, you've heard this before, refugee wars, or we'll call it conflict contagion. It's where conflict will break out in state A refugees go to state B's institutions begin to fail because they can't handle that many people. Conflict breaks out in state B, refugees in state B go to state C again, again, and again. So like dominoes almost. Or that's why we use the term conflict contagion, because it spreads like a virus. And we saw that with the Rwanda genocide. So conflict breaks out in Rwanda between the Hutus and Tutsis. Most of the refugees go to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Can't talk today, I apologize. And so the Rwanda genocide was 1994, as you can see here. By 1996 until 1997, there's the first Congo War. And I can probably hear you thinking, Paul, you charismatic, cool guy, why are you calling it the first Congo War? Because obviously the second Congo War soon followed. Now, within Africa, going further south, we have, of course, another major contender, South Africa. Most famously, within a lot of the American policy was apartheid, or this two-tier system, somewhat similar to Jim Crow, where black people were seen as less than, treated less than legally over the white population descended from settlers there, the Boers, I believe. It was overthrown eventually by the civil rights leader Nelson Mandela, who's here on the right. Currently, one of the biggest issues in Africa, at least with U.S. foreign policy, is Nigeria. This is due to its vast mineral wealth, but it's not developed enough on its own to extract it to the best degree. Because of this, it's usually taken advantage of by non-African nations. I'd go so far as to say Nigeria has the potential to be one of the richest countries in the world if it could only get through these stages of development. Now, there's this issue of competitiveness between states, right? Sometimes we allow states to develop and sometimes we don't. Like I talked about with Japan or Europe after World War II. Some states are just never given that chance, or at least the investments they would need to do that. And Nigeria is a very, very relevant example of that. One of the reasons is the introduction of radical Islamic group ISIL. There's a Nigerian wing of it called Boko Haram, mainly in the east. They hit headlines in 2016 for kidnapping, I think, more than 60 schoolgirls to force them into being war brides for members. I'm not going to go into detail about what war brides are, but it's exactly as well what it sounds like, including the lack of consent. And recently, Nigeria has come up in national headlines again because there's allegations of a genocide. Yeah, so still waiting for the facts on that. You shouldn't throw around the word genocide, but at the same time, you shouldn't deny it. So I'm going to take a neutral stance on that since I don't know the facts. And we have, under War Powers Resolution, have sent troops to Nigeria before. People didn't really know about this. It wasn't really in the news or in the zeitgeist until 2018 when 4 soldiers were killed in the Tongo Tongo ambush. So I think I mentioned this before. The headlines would say like U.S. troops killed in Nigeria, to which a lot of people have said like, well, hold on, we have troops in Nigeria? But in response to the alleged genocide going on now, there have been airstrikes in Nigeria, and to be perfectly honest, there's probably going to be more. Right, Europeans. Let's make fun of people for being different than us. And because the EU, I talked about how people treat Africa like it's a country, but because the EU, you can almost treat Europe like it's a country, or at least the European Union, even though you can't, but you get what I mean. It's somewhere in between. Europe has, of course, an interesting relationship with the United States. It was started off as a European colony. Most of the people who live in the United States are of European descent, myself included. So there's, especially for early days of the relationship, there's this idea of our American cousin. Between the Revolution and the World Wars, U.S.-European relations are distant but friendly. Uh, More metropolitan European Americans or white people tend to have some kinship with their ancestral nations. So if you live in the city and you have, especially if you have money, you're more likely to cross the Atlantic or something like that. But and even in like Italian immigrants, who it was debated if Italians were considered white at the time, but still, Italy is in Europe, had some sort of connection to their homeland that they brought with them, much like current immigrants today. Uh, Europeans tend to think of Americans as boorish frontiersmen. It's sort of a stereotype that a lot of Americans leaned into. The whole frontiersman stereotype, of course, Benjamin Franklin leaned into it when he was ambassador to France. So he was walking around Paris in a beaver skin cap, mainly for peacocking. And no, I'm not going to explain what peacocking is. I'm not a pickup artist. Benjamin Franklin was. Um, but then, of course, the frontiers and the what were at the time called the Indian Wars, or what we'd call now the westward expansion or Native American genocide, colored a lot of how Americans or how a lot of Europeans felt about Americans. Once again, I think the Rough Riders under Teddy Roosevelt were a great example of that. Um, Ethnically diverse, um, diverse among class. I mean, this is cowboys, black sharecroppers, Ivy League athletes, just all sorts of different people forming up this group to fight the Spanish. Now, people like to think of Rough Riders as the biker gang that DMX was rapping about, but I like to think it was, at least some of the lyrics also apply to Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. One of the more interesting stories about American perception to Europeans is Operation Mincemeat, and overall the whole story behind the HMS Seraph. Um, So what this ship was made for, what the submarine was made for, was not attacking ships or anything like that. It was for commandos, getting stuff in and out of Europe very secretly. Operation Mincemeat, which was made into a movie and a musical, um, was this idea of putting fake intel on a dead body and then making the Germans think it was real. Um, but the more interesting one on this is this guy in the bottom left. Not a picture of the actual guy. It's just this guy looked too charming not to have in this, but he's a member of the French Resistance. So one of the jobs for the Seraph was to send a French guy into France to help the resistance fight after he had some training and intel debriefings in the UK. The thing is this French guy, if you know anything about the French, really didn't like the English, and he demanded an American sub. Well, there were no American subs available at the time. There were no American crews available at the time. There was only an American captain available. So to trick the French guy, I couldn't find a picture of the American captain. So here's Clint Eastwood. Um, but uh, to trick the French guy, they made the Seraph into. They pretended it was an American ship. They gave it an American flag and this American captain, and they just told the British crew to act American. But most of them had never met an American before. So, but they'd seen plenty of movies. So they spent the whole time with the French guy in the ship going around talking in one of two accents, either a cowboy or a Chicago gangster, because those were the main movies that they watched at the time. They couldn't do any other American accents. But the French guy fell for it. Um, so part of the HMS Seraph is on the campus of the Citadel, and it's one of the few places in the country where the English flag and the United States flag are flown at the same height. I think the only other big one is the United Nations building. Now, most of you taking this class are Americans, so I'm sure you can guess how most Americans see Europeans. Now, people say it's difficult to develop Africa, and it is, but where there's a will, there's a way. One of the big post-World War II policies toward Europe was the Marshall Plan. I talked about this briefly, but massive, massive, massive amounts of money and loans sent to Europe so they could develop again. And this wasn't necessarily from the kindness of America's heart, because the idea was, well, what caused World War II? Financial woes from World War One. We talked about the inflation and all that. So the idea was is that America is actually making a pretty good return on investment by sending all this money to Europe, because then America won't have to fight in the inevitable World War III. But of course, by then within Europe, a lot of the tribalism that led to, or tribalism, nationalism, whatever you want to call it, that led to the world wars was very much going out of vogue. And there's this idea of European cooperation, especially with the economic boom after the war. This leads to what is probably one of the most important policy decisions in United States history, and it's called the Bretton Woods Agreement. Um, and we're about halfway through the presentation when we're talking about this. So, you can think of this as I'm going to show my elbow and wink a little bit while I say this, even though you can't see me. You could think of this as a midterm of this lecture. You should be able to figure that out. But Bretton Woods Agreement is this idea that the United States is going to have the United States dollar be the reserve currency, and in return, it's going to defend NATO from Russia. So extra good deal for the USA because it makes Europe dependent on us. Extra good deal for Europe because with the mostly demilitarized region, chances of another non-Russian war breaking out are low. That just means that the United States gets to have this big boost to its economy because the dollar is the reserve currency, as we talked about. In exchange, we provide security for the region. Benefits the United States because they're dependent on us for security. And then Europe gets to spend all their money on, I don't know, fancy fish eggs or something. And it seems like an extra good deal at first until, 50, 60 years later, it's, yes, well done, NATO allies. However, the populist wave of the 2010s kicked off in Europe, not in the United States. We talked about how that started in Europe first, largely in part to resentment on American dependence, following the 2008 financial crisis, following the war on terror that got less and less popular over time. And it didn't work out for the security reasons anyway, because war is at NATO's doorstep in Ukraine anyway. So it was a good idea at the time. Overall, probably a net positive, but there are complications with any policy. Now, kind of like FDR, Henry Kissinger, or Ilhan Omar, people have pretty divided thoughts about how they feel about Henry Kissinger. Some people give him credit for helping the United States win the Cold War. Others talk about how he made wars, especially in Cambodia, Vietnam, just unnecessarily cruel. I'm not going to take a stance on Henry Kissinger because you don't need to know my politics. But he does have an interesting quote on Germany. And part of it's interesting because Henry Kissinger himself was born in Germany, but because he is Jewish, had to evacuate. And then he would go on to fight against the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge, which is really weird because Mel Brooks is also Jewish and fought against the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge. So I kind of wonder if they ever met. For those of you who don't know, Mel Brooks is a comedian who made movies like Young Frankenstein, Blazing Saddles, The Producers, History of the World Part 1. So it's weird to think of such a goofy guy and such a serious guy as Kissinger hanging out together fighting the Nazis. Anyway, off topic, his quote about Germany was, poor Germany, too big for Europe, too small for the world. Another one was, the key to Europe is Germany. If Germany goes wrong, Europe goes wrong. Point being is that a big contender, a big leader within the European economy is always going to be Germany due to its large population and industrial base. Which leads to this photo, which kind of perfectly exemplifies the American relationship with Germany. Leaning on the table in the blue pantsuit, I assume, is former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. And at her side, next to her left hand, there's that glass of water. On the other side of that glass of water is the hand of Emmanuel Macron, leader of France, president of France, which is probably close behind Germany in its power within Europe. Both of them united against Trump, sitting with his arms crossed. And then who is also on Trump's side with his arms crossed is Japanese PM Shinzo Abe. So it's this whole, to me, it's just this whole exemplification of European frustration with America's lack of cooperation and America's sort of idea that why do we have to cooperate? We're pivoting east, which was the policy at the time, pivoting toward especially Japan, Korea, and India. Major North American policies: Canada, Mexico, Latin America, and Haiti in the Caribbean, or Caribbean. I've heard it pronounced both ways. Now, aside from getting stomped by US hockey at the Olympics, Canada is actually known for some other things too, such as burning down the White House during the War of 1812. But as the other major English-speaking country on the continent, America and Canada have sort of a can be strained at times relationship. Even though every Canadian I've met's been a perfectly nice person. My roommate when I was in Nepal was just one of the coolest guys ever, and yeah, he was Canadian. But it's not to say Canada doesn't have problems. One of the big ones that's just sort of never talked about in the United States is housing prices in Canada, or since this has been taken, they are currently around 4 times what they are in the United States. And they're not good in the United States, as most of you are going to find out once you graduate and get jobs. Furthermore, there's this huge influx of immigrants going into Canada that some people like, some people dislike. And then one of the more macabre ones is their policy of MAID, or medical assistance in dying. Back in the 90s and 2000s, it was called assisted suicide. But that's becoming one of the more common ways to die in Canada. For about 10 years, the Prime Minister of Canada was Justin Trudeau. I talked about him before. You might know him better as Katy Perry's boyfriend. Like I said, I still couldn't believe it when I found out they were dating. Like I think I said this joke before, but my sister told me that they were dating, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, right. I'm sure they're totally dating." And Angela Merkel is dating one of the Jonas brothers, but no, this one turned out to be true. But long time as a left-wing PM, and then a year or two ago, there was this interview of that went sort of viral. It was this conservative Canadian, very big contender for prime minister, Pierre Poilievre. and he is owning the libs with facts and logic while eating an apple. Um, I hope you noticed the sarcasm I said in that. It's a good interview for him. It just went very viral in right-wing circles. Um, but after this, there was a big push for him to be the conservative PM to balance out 10 years of left-wing or more liberal Justin Trudeau. Of course, foreign policy toward Canada really shifted once after the election in 2024. What Trump called Liberation Day, or this idea that we're going to start a bunch of tariffs on different states. Canada was a major receiver of these tariffs, and it really damaged American esteem in Canadian eyes. And of course, culturally, the US lost esteem in Canada's eyes when Trump called Canada the 51st state, and Prime Minister Trudeau, he'd refer to him as Governor Trudeau. Um, Canadians are some of the nicest people out there, but they're still proud to be Canadian. And so this really didn't sell well in a lot of their eyes. And it hurt the Canadian conservatives because Trump himself is conservative. And a lot of people will defend the 51st state thing as a joke. But to some other people, it will read as sort of a joke to actually see how people feel about it. Think of like a boy and girl in high school, and the boy is like, "Oh, how funny would it be if we dated?" But I mean that as a joke. Well, let's say the guy has a crush on her, right? It's sort of the same thing. Exactly the same thing, actually. Canada being the 51st state is America being friend zoned. I'm being sarcastic. Anyway, uh, Polidori wasn't able to become the new PM of Canada. Instead, left-wing liberal Justin Trudeau is replaced by another more left-leaning, sort of more toward the center, though, Mark Carney. Okay, let's go down south to Mexico. Sure, we all know where Mexico is. There's their president, Claudia Sheinbaum. Within Mexico domestically, I would say there's four big issues. Of course, cartel violence. There is the best guess as to what the cartels look like now. Last week, a high-ranking, semi-retired cartel leader was killed by Mexican special forces. So this map is going to be scrambled all over again soon. Another big issue that Mexicans talk about all the time that Americans don't is illegal goods crossing the border. Well, let me expand on that. Illegal goods crossing the border to the south. No, America's not sending drugs to Mexico. What's that? Drugs are the cartel problem, of course. But 80% of cartel guns were made in the United States. So America will complain about cartel violence, and then Mexican policymakers, politicians will throw it right back and say, well, they're doing it with American guns. Another one, inequality is super, super high in Mexico. Until 2013, a lot of big oil families controlled a ton of the wealth. Um, then it was nationalized in 2013. But then the other big one that people also, sort of like guns, people don't really think of when you think of Mexico is illegal immigration. Some of you are probably thinking, what issue does Mexico have with illegal immigration? Aside from their family members moving out or something like that, where it's not necessarily the case. You see, these are the migration, on the left are the migration caravans from the Biden administration. So huge waves of migrants going through Mexico, but it's not just Mexicans, it's other states illegally immigrating to Mexico first and then going through Mexico to the United States. So Mexico has their own unsecured southern border, in some sort of weird irony, unsecured southern border that right-wing Mexican politicians don't like. So this is the mayor of Tijuana, where if you look, it's just under San Diego on the map on the left. Sort of the end point. So where these critical masses of illegal migrants come through, and he's wearing a "Make Tijuana Great Again" hat. This was in 2018, 2019, so before Biden, but still an interesting case. And of course, Mexican American relations have generally been more strained than American Canadian relations, from the Mexico secession to the build the wall rhetoric. Um, but I got a hot take for you guys. And that hot take is this. If you've ever been to Europe, you've probably noticed that the culture there is very different. It's literally Europe. Um, Great example of that being the tiny little cars. My hot take is that Mexico is more in common with the United States than Europe has more in common with the United States. Because I genuinely do not believe that the European mind can comprehend a Ford F-150. It's a joke, of course, but a little bit of truth to that. We do have more culturally similar with Mexico than we do Europe in a lot of different ways. Now, one of the biggest policies with the United States, Mexico, and Canada was NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, in force from '94 to 2020, promoting trade between U.S., Canada, and Mexico. So just more cooperation between the three countries. Mexico and Canada are still the biggest trading partners of the United States because of its proximity. Of course, this was implemented under Bill Clinton. And at first, it caused this big economic boom we talk about in the post-Soviet era. People are getting stuff for super, super cheap. After that, though, people noticed that a lot of jobs are being hollowed out and sent to, especially Mexico, because labor is cheaper there. So it ended up having sort of a spotty history and was eventually, like this graphic indicates, suspended in 2020. Moving off that, we've got the Caribbean, and we'll get to Haiti in a second. But Caribbean, aside from illegal migration and different islands, different Latin American countries taking different positions on communism, there's of course the drug trade. So Barry Seal on the top right was a CIA informant and drug smuggler. And on the bottom right is Rick Ross, who had a similar role, but he didn't know he was working for the CIA. He thought he was just a drug dealer. Since then, he's been to prison, reformed himself, and is a major anti-drug advocate. Now, skipping Haiti to keep going down south for a second, there is Brazil. Now, Brazil's in a strange position because it's major superpower, probably the hegemon within South America, major trade partner with the United States, but is part of this membership called BRICS, or Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is meant to be like this alternative world alignment going on from NATO. So they're more focused on trade than security. So because of this, Brazil is often accused of playing both sides. But if, for one thing, if Brazil is getting better deals, their first, or the Brazilian government's first obligation is to its people. So what's the issue with that? Second of all, both sides are very unstable between the volatility of the United States economy, leadership, between that whole alternative economy not really being able to formally do anything too substantial yet. So Brazilian relations, just like Mexico, Canada, took a very big strain with the wave of tariffs, and we'll have to see how that pans out. All right, let's talk about Haiti. I've spoken French since primary school because I grew up in backcountry Louisiana. Um, so I've always had a soft spot for Haitian, especially Haitian Creole, because it's such a cool language. Another very cool thing about Haiti is it started with a slave rebellion. People will say this is for different reasons, but one of the unfortunate things about Haiti is that it is not very stable since then. The U.S. really hasn't done it many favors. It's intervened in Haiti from 1915 to 1934. The Haitian president was assassinated, and the U.S. invaded and occupied it to prevent German influence in the area. Some more conspiratorial people will say it's also punishment for being a successful slave rebellion, since this was still the time of the Jim Crow South. 57 to 86, U.S. helped keep dictators Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier in power despite their human rights abuses. And from 91 to 2004, U.S. is involved in coups against President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and he directly blamed the U.S. in 2004 for this. Of course, not all of them were successful. Now, one of the more interesting and unfortunate things about Haiti is that not only was their president assassinated in 2021 in his compound, but we still don't know who did it. 5 years later, it's still just publicly, not even the Associated Press, who is normally super reliable, knows who killed President Jovenel Moise. There's a video of the assassins raiding the compound and killing him. So you'd think there would be some level of evidence, but at least none is publicly available. Main suspects are others in the Haitian government trying to overthrow a coup. The investigation for that ended in 2024, not conclusive. Others think he was involved in drugs and something went south there. Others think it was the Wagner Group or that Russian group of assassins or mercenaries that tried to overthrow Russia 2023, I believe, summer 23. It happened like right after the whole Titan implosion around the Titanic. Others suggest it might be the CIA. I have no opinion on that. We saw this with the different African countries, and you see it in China in the early 1900s. It's a pattern that's very common. Unstable governments cause warlords to come to power. Sometimes they eventually become dictators. So after the president was killed, one of the major warlords that came to power was this guy, Jimmy Cherizier, um, better known as General Barbecue. And uh, I know Haiti is not Africa, but Haitian and African warlords tend to have very interesting names. There's General Butt Naked, General Mosquito, and his rival General Mosquito Spray. And I swear I'm not making any of that up. Very, very interesting names. And another big thing that is caused by unstable governments is big booms in mass migration. So there was the Springfield, Ohio, leading up to the 24 election. That was a big deal because the accusation was that the population had grown 25% over 3 years, in large part due to Haitian immigrants. And overall, that leads an interesting question. Does the U.S. have any responsibility to Haitian migrants, to take them in? We went over all these years of the U.S. intervening in Haitian politics. Is it fair to punish them for being unstable, or is there something we owe to the Haitian people? Food for thought. But once you think about that, think about, does the U.S. have a responsibility to Cuban migrants? Because we talked about the 500 plus assassination attempts on Castro. we're still not allowed to trade with Cuba because of the embargo. Venezuelan migrants, we kidnapped their president. Iranian migrants. It goes to this whole idea of invade the world, invite the world, or that war and mass migration aren't two separate issues. Of course, we're going to have to leave it there for the rest of today. There just isn't enough time to go over every security issue and all of these, every economic issue and all of these. But hopefully that leaves some food for thought. And if any of these you find interesting and you want to learn more, reach out to me. So today we finished Spheres of Influence, Africa, Europe, North America, South America. And then Thursday we will go over Asia, the Middle East, Antarctica, and outer space. And I especially believe the outer space one is going to be very cool. Mainly because as far as I know, no war crimes have been committed there. Same with Antarctica. Beyond that, if you have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to reach out. We'll find some time to work Australia in there too. But yeah, gonna leave it at that. See ya.